The fog in the Argonne Forest wasn't just typical weather, it was a hungry, living, and breathing thing that had been waiting patiently for over a century to claim its next set of victims. Thousands of brave, young men walked into that suffocating darkness, thinking it was just another routine day at the front line, never realizing for a single second that they were stepping completely off the map of reality and into a nightmare that would never end. They were walking into a place where the rules of the world no longer applied, and the shadows were already reaching out to pull them into the void. The mud beneath their heavy boots seemed to scream and moan with every single step they took, as if the ground beneath them was a living, sentient entity trying to pull them down into a shallow, silent, and muddy grave. The air was thick with the scent of decay and fear, making it impossible to breathe without feeling the weight of the forest pressing against their chests. Every soldier felt the eyes of something ancient watching them from behind the trees, waiting for the perfect moment to strike and erase them from existence, leaving behind nothing but their forgotten names and rusted gear. You look at these old, grainy photos today, and you might see nothing but twisted, broken trees and a thick, unnatural mist, but if you look closer, if you really take the time to look, you can feel them watching, still trapped in a brutal war that ended long ago. There is a weight to these images, a sense of dread that lingers long after you look away, because the forest never let them leave. They are still there, standing in the cold, forever waiting for someone to hear their silent cries for help, but the forest only offers silence in return. Time itself became a lost ghost in those woods, and the soldiers quickly learned that in the Argonne, the greatest danger wasn't the enemy soldiers or the artillery fire, but the terrifying, soul-crushing realization that they were no longer walking alone. They felt a presence following them, a cold shadow that moved when they moved and stopped when they stopped, mirroring their every action with malicious intent. The deeper they marched into the labyrinth of trees, the more they realized that the exit had vanished, replaced by an endless cycle of dark, impenetrable forest that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Every branch snapped like a brittle bone under the pressure of the forest, and every gust of wind sounded like a whispered name, drawing the men deeper into the absolute abyss. They were marching toward a dark, inevitable destiny that was written in ink and blood, completely unaware that the path they had come from had already been erased by the creeping shadows. There was no going back now, the trees had closed their ranks, and the sky had turned into a thick, suffocating canopy of black that hid the stars and the moon, leaving them with only the dark. That's when the whispers started, not in their ears, but echoing inside their own minds, telling them dark secrets that made their sanity fracture like thin, brittle glass. They tried to shout at each other, but the forest seemed to swallow their voices, leaving them with nothing but the chilling sound of their own thoughts turning against them. It was a psychological breakdown in real time, where the lines between who they were and what the forest wanted them to be began to blur into a terrifying, singular darkness. They soon realized with pure, unadulterated horror that they were walking in circles, passing the same blood-stained, twisted tree for the third time, trapped in a loop designed by something ancient, cruel, and hungry. Panic set in as the realization hit them like a physical blow. The forest was shrinking, the walls of trees were closing in like the bars of a cage, and there was absolutely no way to escape the cycle they were stuck in. Every step they took felt like a step deeper into a prison that had no doors and no windows. The bunker appeared suddenly out of the mist, as if it had been ripped out of the deepest pits of hell and dropped into the middle of the battlefield, a stone mouth waiting to swallow them whole. It looked ancient, its concrete walls covered in strange, unidentifiable markings that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of their lanterns. The sheer presence of the structure made the air grow cold and heavy, a feeling of dread so intense that it felt like someone was walking over their future graves. Stepping inside the bunker felt like walking into the throat of a monster, where the air was thick with the foul, suffocating smell of iron, rot, and centuries of forgotten, desperate prayers. Their footsteps echoed on the damp floor, the sound stretching out into the darkness and coming back to them as if something else was following behind, matching their pace. They were no longer soldiers of a great nation. They were prey, hiding in the dark, waiting for whatever was hunting them to finally strike from the shadows. They saw things in the corners of the bunker, flickers of faces that looked exactly like their own, but twisted into expressions of pure, unadulterated, soul-crushing madness. Every time they turned their lanterns towards the corner, the shadow would shift, leaving them staring at empty walls that seemed to bleed a dark, viscous substance. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, and they could feel that the bunker was toying with them, drawing out their fear until they were nothing but hollow shells. One soldier gripped his rifle so hard his knuckles bled, absolutely terrified that if he blinked for even a second, he wouldn't just lose his mind, but his very soul. He stared into the darkness at the end of the hall, seeing things that defied human understanding, shapes that stretched and contorted in ways that human bow. The walls of that cold, damp bunker seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, a slow, rhythmic thudding that perfectly matched the terror pounding in their chests. They could feel the stone vibrating against their palms, a low-frequency hum that made their vision blur and their thoughts fracture into disjointed, screaming nightmares. It wasn't just a structure, it was a living organ, and they were trapped inside its veins, being digested by a history that didn't belong to them, but was now becoming their own. The deeper they went, the more the laws of physics seemed to dissolve into nothingness, leaving them in a place where light feared to tread and shadows had a weight of their own. They found rooms filled with military equipment from wars that hadn't even happened yet. Rusted, unrecognizable steel and strange, glowing wires that made their skin crawl with an intense, static-like energy. It was as if time had folded in on itself, trapping them in a convergence point where past, present, and future were all screaming at the same time. Every shadow in the corner had a distinct, predatory shape, and every shape seemed to reach out with long, thin, translucent fingers whenever they turned their backs to the wall. They tried to keep their lanterns held high, but the flames were turning a sickly, unnatural blue, casting long, dancing silhouettes that didn't match the movements of the men themselves. These shadows were separate entities, ancient guardians of the bunker that were feeding on the soldiers' confusion and rapidly depleting hope. The voices were louder now, no longer just whispers in the back of their minds, but clear, mocking, and distinct tones of their own mothers, wives, and lovers calling them from the darkness ahead. The soldiers froze, hearts hammering against their ribs, as the voices promised them safety, warmth, and a way out of the freezing, hellish nightmare of the trenches. They knew, with a sinking dread, that these voices were nothing but traps, lures designed by the bunker to lure them into the deepest, darkest chambers where they would never be seen again. They stumbled upon a room where the air was colder than ice, a frigid, unnatural chill that froze the very moisture in their lungs and made their breath hang in the air like ghostly mist. The floor was covered in the personal effects of 100 missing men, letters that had never been sent, family photographs warped by dampness, and boots still laced as if the owners had simply vanished into thin air. It was a graveyard of abandoned memories, and they were the latest additions, slowly being stripped of their identities by the hungry void of the bunker. The sanity of the men was hanging by a single, fraying thread as they realized that the bunker was not just a hiding place, but a digestive system for the entire forest. They started seeing their own doppelgangers standing in the dark, watching. They couldn't trust their eyes, they couldn't trust their ears, and they certainly couldn't trust the men standing right next to them, as the bunker began to play cruel tricks on their perception. Every time they looked at one another, their faces seemed to shift and distort in the dim light, morphing into features that belonged to strangers or worse, into faces of people they had already seen die in the trenches. The psychological pressure was immense, driving a wedge between the survivors and turning their deepest, most private fears against each other in the darkness. A soldier named Bennett finally reached his breaking point and tried to touch his own reflection in a stagnant puddle of water on the floor, hoping to find a hint of his former self. But as his fingers brushed the surface, the water rippled violently, and a cold, clawed hand shot out from the dark, freezing depths, grabbing his wrist with a grip like iron. He screamed as he was pulled down, but his voice was suddenly cut short, replaced by a strange, discordant sound that resembled thousands of tortured voices crying out in unison. The bunker seemed to react to the violence, the walls groaning and shifting as if the structure itself was physically consuming the man who had been taken into the depths. The remaining soldiers scrambled backward, their hearts pounding in a frantic rhythm, but they found that the hallway they had just walked through had vanished completely, replaced by a solid, cold wall of unyielding stone. They were sealed in, trapped in a room that was slowly shrinking, the ceiling descending with an agonizingly slow, rhythmic grind that promised a crushing end. The terror reached a boiling point when they realized that even the light from their remaining lanterns was beginning to warp, turning into a thick, black ink that stained everything it touched. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was a physical, malevolent presence that moved like a rising tide, swallowing the room bit by bit and extinguishing any hope of warmth or clarity. They huddled together, back to back, but the shadows were already between them, cutting off their lines of sight and isolating each man in his own personal nightmare. The bunker began to vibrate with a low-frequency sound that rattled their teeth and made their vision blur with intense, throbbing pain, as if something massive was shifting beneath the foundation. One by one, the soldiers started to lose their memories, forgetting the faces of their families, the names of their hometowns, and the very reasons why they were fighting this war in the first place. They were becoming nothing more than empty husks, waiting for the forest to reclaim their spirits and discard their remains in the deep, forgotten corners of the bunker. The darkness offered them a strange, terrifying promise of peace if they just let go, if they just stopped.